Thanks very much. I'm glad everybody is here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to read to you a bit from my portion of the book. I wanted to tell you a little bit about it first. The book, it's a long time in the making, 3.5 years since we sat down and started working on it. For me, the inception of the book really has to do with the invasion of Panama. When I witnessed the invasion of Panama and witnessed the events leading up to the invasion of Panama, and saw more death than one would like to see during the invasion of Panama. And it started a long quest to understand exactly what had happened and why it had happened. And those events really lead me here today. After the invasion, I followed General Noriega's path back to the United States, covered the drug trial, covered the entire process by which Noriega was brought into a court and convicted on a series of drug conspiracy counts in the United States. And in the course of doing this, something needed, for me, journalistically, something more needed to be done. I needed to find out more information. I wasn't satisfied with a lot of the things I was hearing and saying and were being said. And really, when I was approached by Random House to work on this project and to interview General Noriega, that's really why I did it, to close the circle, to try to find what other questions I had, what other answers I could find to those questions. In some cases, I needed to find the questions before I could find the answers. The result is this book, which is really two books in a way. It's two separate items. It's General Noriega speaking about his political life. It's a political memoir. Focusing certainly on the most important years of his political career. And then it's my introduction, my assessment, my look at the two most important events that brought him here and brought me here, which were the invasion of Panama and the subsequent drug trial. My conclusions are based on interviews and conversations with Panamanians, Americans, drug enforcement officials, political officials, military officials, CIA agents. My feeling was that to be able to make some of the statements that I end up making, I would have to first go beyond listening to General Noriega's words. He speaks for himself, but one would expect him to, like anyone else, to defend himself. And I go beyond that journalistically and say, let's assess what he has to say in terms of what others can tell me. What I really find is that rarely has the resident wisdom been so divergent from the information that others have given me about this case. So that's really the series of events that lead up to my writing and working with him on this book. I have three selections that I'll read to you. The first discusses my first meeting with General Noriega in jail in 1993. The second describes my experience of the U.S. invasion of Panama, and then the third wraps up some of the conclusions that I come to. Happy to talk to you about any other aspects that aren't mentioned after that's over, and I'll be here as long as you like for that. The first piece that I'm going to read to you takes us back to a different period of time. It was 8 years ago. The Berlin Wall was still up. There was still a Soviet Union. It was the latter half of the beginning of the Bush administration, latter half of 88, 89. And relations between Panama and the United States were deteriorating. And I recalled this meeting first meeting that I had with Noriega many years before I realized that I would be, or he would be in the situation he was in. I recalled this first encounter I had with him when I met him in jail, and this is what it was like. I reminded Noriega early on that we had met once before. The brief meeting came 4 years prior to our encounter in the Miami jail on October 11th, 1989, 1 week after a coup attempt that almost took his life. At the time, the Soviet Union had not been yet dismantled. The Berlin Wall was still intact. Wars were still being waged in El Salvador and Nicaragua, although Central American presidents were negotiating around the United States toward a settlement that would end the conflict in Central America, in which tens of thousands of people were killed and billions of US dollars expended in a supposed war to contain communism. The United States was active in fighting a drug war in Colombia and was controlling anti-narcotics forces in the South American countries of Peru and Bolivia, all with the aim of destroying coca leaf production, although endemic poverty was also at the root of cocaine production. In tiny Panama, a war was brewing. The United States had imposed economic sanctions on Panama after a federal indictment in Miami had charged Noriega, the U.S. longtime confidant on sensitive matters of international security, with drug trafficking and drug conspiracy. The United States financed and supported the Panamanian opposition in its attempt to defeat Noriega's Democratic Revolutionary Party in May 1989 balloting. Noriega's government canceled the election count. The United States had invested money and prestige in the opposition candidates. By mid-year 1989, the Bush administration had set up an invasion plan. Admiral William Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Fred Werner, the Panama-based head of the U.S. Southern Command, went to the State Department in early summer and voiced opposition to the invasion. They were both dismissed. Werner was criticized by conservatives and Panamanian opposition leaders for being too soft on the Panamanian military and was replaced by another general who was given the task of setting up the invasion. Crowe, who was born in the Panama Canal Zone, was replaced by Colin Powell. Noriega and his forces were tense. There were occasional and escalating provocations with U.S. forces who not only lived in absurdly close proximity to, but also worked alongside their supposed enemies. The Panamanian Defense Forces were created and fostered by the United States. Noriega was a graduate of U.S. military training, and he was a liaison officer between Torrijos and the Americans. Omar Torrijos, that is, Noriega's mentor, died in a plane crash in 1981 amid charges and countercharges never proved that the death was other than accidental. He was buried at Fort Amador at a site that symbolized the absurdity of the situation. It was a small neck of land extending out into the Panama Canal, an enclave of ivy-covered administration buildings and tended greenery that evoked all the quaintness of the colonial protectorate that Panama had been since 1903. Amador and the Canal Zone at large had been mostly returned to Panamanian control in stages after the 1977 Panama Canal treaties. So now, next to Noriega's command office at Fort Amador, framed by the mausoleum where Torrijos was buried, there were still buildings occupied by the Americans. The fort was guarded by a Panamanian U.S. military checkpoint jointly. It was a coexistence born of the colonial relationship between a superpower and its surrogate army. But the surrogate army was in open defiance. Noriega saw a widespread conspiracy against him and against Panama. He saw journalists, especially American journalists, as tools of that conspiracy, if not conspirators in their own right. And so in the days after the October 3rd coup, which found him huddled on the floor and praying for a swift and painless death, he banned the entry of American journalists into Panama. Well, I got around that anyway and was reporting on the growing war in Panama nevertheless. I'd been seeking an interview with Noriega through his aides in Panama City to obtain his own version of the coup attempt. I was told that Noriega would be attending a diplomatic event at the Rio Hato Air Base, a one-time U.S. Army air base, and that this might be a good opportunity to speak to him. It was indeed. Despite all the rumors about Noriega, about CIA plots and military plots to kill him, I was surprised that I could find a way to enter Rio Hato very easily without anybody stopping me. I drove through a guard booth without so much as having to stop or show an ID card. I drove until I came to a party facility which had a bar at one end. Traveling with some friends, I parked the car, walked into the party area. A number of men were gathered around in small groups, drinking beers and chatting, and among them some foreign military advisors. I remember a Canadian and a French military attaché in particular who I spoke to, and I spoke for a while to the Panamanian ambassador to Haiti and to several other Panamanians, all the time wondering when Noriega would make the appearance. "When does he show up?" I asked one Panamanian standing nearby. "Oh, wait a minute, he's here," the Panamanian said, and nodded toward a figure standing to one side of the building in the shadows of the thatched roof, very close to where we stood. It was Manuel Antonio Noriega, holding a long-necked bottle of beer, dressed in field fatigues and a baseball cap, and looking perhaps a bit out of place. I was surprised again that there was no security entourage at the base or anywhere in evidence, and this at a time when, purportedly, Panama and the United States were on the verge of war. "General," I said, approaching him and offering my hand, "I'm a reporter from the United States. I'd like to ask a few questions." Noriega appeared startled by the approach. "But don't you know I'm afraid of reporters?" he said. "I don't like talking to reporters." I said, "Well, no reason to be afraid of me. I'm a pretty nice guy. Why don't we just talk?" And he said, "Well, why don't you talk to Lopez and see if we can work something out," referring to one of his aides. Nothing was ever worked out. Years later, I told this whole story like I've told you to Noriega, and he told me that he remembered the event, certainly, but he didn't remember my being there. It was the anniversary celebration of Rio Hato's air base when it was returned to Panamanian custody from U.S. control. Try as he could, he had no memory of an American reporter approaching him and asking for an interview. "But it's true," he said, "I always was afraid of reporters, the way they were going to twist my words and what I was trying to say. I still am." In the end, after 3 years of talking to him, Noriega sought to avoid a tell-all tabloid account of scandal. He wanted, rather, to correct the history of his life and times. During the 1992 presidential election, many people assumed that the imprisoned general would reveal some last-minute detail about George Bush or some other U.S. politician. Perhaps a personal intrigue, perhaps information on a secret intelligence operation, something that would turn the tide of the election. It never happened. Noriega said he had no such information, that the behavior of Bush and the hypocrisy and moral compromise of American policy were scandal enough for him. In part, Noriega clearly decided to take the high road. There were stories to be told in Panama about the drug abuse of one U.S. senator or skirt-chasing activities of another, but Noriega chose not to tell those stories. If he had happened to have a juicy story about Bush, he might have told that, but he didn't. Now, the second part of what I'm going to read is very much my experience of what happened on December 20th, 1989. Journalists are privileged and sometimes condemned to have the first look at history, and this was really more than one could have imagined. Witnessing the Panama invasion was something that I'll never forget. This section is entitled Death. I covered the Panamanian elections of 1989, the deteriorating relations with the United States on through the October coup. On December 20th, I was home with my family preparing for the holidays when I received a call from a friend in Washington. Our mutual Pentagon source, he said, was telling me to get to Panama immediately, that the U.S. invasion was about to begin. Well, I just returned from a long stint in Colombia, where I wrote about the death of Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, the notorious don of the Medellin cocaine cartel. My later reporting would show that the U.S. government participated in the killing of Gacha, although President Bush would later deny any official U.S. role. From my vantage point in Bogota, I could not fully perceive the drumbeat and the rhetoric building against Noriega. It seemed incredible to me that such an attack would actually take place. I didn't believe at any point that the United States would invade Panama, so I refused to take the advice of my source, even though I knew the information was authoritative. By midnight that same night, I knew I was wrong. I had to wait 2 long days before a journalist's charter plane could fly to Panama to cover the invasion. Our Lockheed 1011 jet was hit by rifle fire from snipers below as it landed at Howard Air Force Base in the Canal Zone. The U.S. military would not allow journalists to venture out of their perimeter and held 200-odd reporters on that flight in protective custody overnight before releasing us. The next morning, the scope of the invasion was clear. Despite sniper fire and isolated skirmishes, the Americans had applied massive force that left the country devastated and the Panamanian Defense Forces no more. Their headquarters were only a charred wreckage from a fierce firefight that had destroyed a neighborhood of shanty dwellings. The Americans said few civilians died, hardly any of them in Trujillo, but some civilians claimed they trampled over dead bodies to flee for their lives from Trujillo that night. I saw a blasted vehicle with the carbonized remains of a human being, the body almost melted by whatever had attacked that human being. Wherever there was death or destruction, the U.S. military assured reporters that it had been caused by Noriega's men or by dignity battalions. Dignity battalions who Noriega described as civil defense, but who the Americans described as thugs. This carbonized body was that of a member of the dignity battalions, we were told, although I doubt any investigation or identification was possible or attempted. Using the words dignity battalion, I assumed, justified the human remains being there, making the death a little bit more acceptable. To find out more about the death, I went to the Central City morgue at Santo Tomas Hospital. It was Christmas Eve. Small groups of people, mostly women, huddled outside the morgue, oppressed by the fetid smell of death in the tropical sun. They wailed and sobbed, holding handkerchiefs to their mouths as they tiptoed through the bodies. The odor of death in the tropical heat would linger with them, as it lingered with me. One of the women was looking for her brother, a Navy lieutenant who had left home the night of the invasion and who had not been seen since. She stood about 50 paces from the entrance to the morgue, a cement ramp surrounded by tropical contrasts, palm trees, bright flowers, casting occasional shadows down the entranceway. She waited for nothing but the courage to summon up a move toward the door. Her whimpering breath mingled with the sounds of others, whispering, turning away from the wind, which carried the terrible scent on the breeze on to the city and the Pacific Oceans, where its essence was never quite gone. A hospital official checked a list. Her brother was not on it. "Go home," the hospital official said. "Go home before you look here. Wait another day," the official told her. The sun slipped intermittently behind clouds that dimmed the tropical heat. The shade was good, but by afternoon the sun was bright again and the stench was overpowering. Her brother had come home on December 20th, 1989, the Wednesday afternoon of the invasion. He had come home to the family house in a nice section of the humble San Miguelito district and stayed for a while. He spoke a bit, but in the hours before it became clear that Noriega was out, he had kept mostly to himself, pacing in the yard or in the small living room. Then he had slipped away from home to go fight the Americans. The family feared he would now be one of the nameless dead. So she and her sister had come together to the morgue. In the office, blessedly, air conditioners at the hospital relieved the ever-present smell. There was a small Christmas tree on the desk, a poster reminding Panamanians to make cornea donations to the eye bank, and a prayer. "Lord, discover my solitude that I may later work for thee, for the salvation of the world." The older of the sisters said, "Can we see the list of bodies brought in since Friday?" She placed a paper towel over her nose as she approached an orderly. "Go to the chapel tomorrow," the worker said. "They will have pictures of the dead from all over the city." It was a relief for the sister that she would not have to enter. The 70 bodies had been piled on top of one another, and trying to identify each one was a grisly task. As she left the building, she glanced left, and she saw a body wrapped in an embroidered cloth. "How do people work here?" she asked softly, half to herself. "How can this be happening?" Standing nearby was another woman, a stranger seeking solace and giving some. Her daughter had been killed by a sniper's bullet at a downtown hotel. She had come to recover the body. She was 25 years old, so young, the woman said, struggling to speak. Bullets were flying everywhere, and one came through the window and got her here. She placed an index finger on the furrow of her brow. A doctor came along with another list of the dead. "What is this list?" someone asked. "It is the dead we have registered here," said the doctor. It contained the names of more than 100 people who had died in downtown Panama City in the 72 hours since the December 20th invasion. "But please understand," the doctor said, grasping my arm, "this does not include the babies and children. You must understand me." He then walked hurriedly away, ignoring a request that he explain what that meant, and I could never find him again. The Americans and the Panamanians who took power when Noriega was overthrown said 326 Panamanians had been killed. A doctor at the American Gorgas Hospital in the old Canal Zone said the number was impossibly low. The number and the reality had become a political affair, some declaring the low figure, some declaring 10 times more deaths, but none fully justifying their claims. Juan Mendez, the executive director of the human rights organization America's Watch, told me this: It is not the quantity of the dead. It is the question of why anybody had to die at all. Noriega was there that night in Panama City. He watched the firefight from a distance. Down in the city, I tracked the death of perhaps the first person to die in the Panama invasion. He was a man named Roberto Miller Saldana, and he lay dying. Miller Saldana and 4 fellow transit policemen were standing at a small highway guard post near Howard Air Base when the first wave of U.S. troops arrived. He was one of 3,000 or 4,000 members of Noriega's Panamanian Defense Forces who was no soldier at all. Miller Saldana was a cop on the beat. When the Americans began pouring out of the U.S. base, Miller Saldana and his friends on duty started to run. He didn't make it. The others did. So the likely first casualty in the U.S. invasion of Panama was a Panamanian policeman shot in the back. His cousin, Milsa de Hastings, told about Miller's life between gagging breaths outside the morgue. It was her grim task to identify Roberto's body. He was a transit cop. He couldn't fight. He wouldn't resist. All he had was a pistol. One of his friends called us. They made it. He was the only one that didn't. I guess he just didn't run as fast as the others. When his wife's son, a cousin and brother-in-law, Walter Valenzuela, arrived at the hospital, security was tight. U.S. soldiers wearing camouflage gear and grease paint checked identification of those entering and exiting the grounds. There was confusion about where to receive information on the dead. The information desk had ceased reading out the list of names, and anxious people were unsure where to go to find their missing family members. Finally, they were allowed to walk into the makeshift morgue. They found the ghastly scene of bodies splayed upon bodies, blood congealing on the floor and splattered on the walls, flies getting caught as they flicked at the sticky red pools. After stepping around the room, they found a tag with his name and looked over the remains. Walter walked back from the morgue. It was him. I got a good look, Valenzuela said. There were 2 bullet holes in his back. Mark Twain wrote that there was never a just war, never an honorable one on the part of the instigator of the war. Statesmen will invent cheap lies, putting the blame on the nation that is attacked, and every man will be glad of those conscience-soothing falsities. And thus he will, by and by, convince himself that the war is just, and will thank God for the better sleep he enjoys after this process of grotesque self-deception. The death, destruction, and injustice wrought in the name of fighting Noriega, and the lies surrounding that enterprise were threats to the basic American principles of democracy. That will not change until history is repaired, until self-deception is replaced by common sense, and chauvinism is erased by reality. My effort was to go beyond the obvious and the already written, to show that behind the complacent sense that nothing went wrong, much to the contrary, U.S. policy toward Panama in the 1980s was on an ignorant, twisted, and deadly course. Nothing makes a soldier so angry, and nothing can be so unfair as to suggest that he is callous about having to kill. If he is balanced, a soldier hates to kill. He kills because he is so trained. He kills because he is so ordered. He does so with faith in his country, whatever country, and with anguish in his heart. Soldiers were ordered to kill in Panama, and they did so after being told that they had to rescue a country from the clamp of a cruel, depraved dictator. Once they acted, the people of their country marched lockstep behind them. It was left for the Panamanians and the few observers of that attack to ask how it could have happened. Mostly, the event receded into a vague history, forgotten and cast aside. But this was the United States of America, and this was the place under whose laws the President and the Senate, by a 2/3 vote in 1977, pledged never again to interfere in the internal affairs of Panama. Panama, a creation of Teddy Roosevelt, Panama, a prototype of manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine. The signing of the Panama Canal Treaty was a watershed in relations with Latin America, a decided turn away from past conduct, intended to establish a new relationship of equality, not only with Panama, but also with the hemisphere. This was so much the case that the United States, under President Carter, invited the other countries of the hemisphere to sign the Panama Neutrality Treaty to cement a new regional partnership based on sovereignty and mutual respect. To say that the situation on December 20th, 1989, the U.S. invasion of Panama, was so extraordinary that Noriega, whatever he did, was worse than Pinochet in Chile or Stroessner in Paraguay or any other dictator in Latin America or anywhere else, or that Panama deserved what it received, is to divert attention from the essential truth. The United States, under George Bush, invaded Panama because George Bush had the power to invade Panama and was able to do so to meet his own agenda. Bush needed no declaration of war, and any justification would do. He was convinced, and he was self-deceiving in his decision. The consequences and the lives were beyond his consideration. The shambles of U.S. actions and responsibility in Panama were the results of the actions of rigid and ruthless ideology. Noriega was the target, but the responsibility lies with a country whose citizens should not be so complacent as to fall for the rhetoric. At the very least, the consequences must be analyzed, the impact must be seen, and the culprits must be revealed for the sake of history. So ends my afterword to the book. And with that, I'll take any questions you have about anything I've said or any other part of the memoir.
Mark. Peter, did you get a chance to interview Bush or Colin Powell?
I attempted to interview George Bush, specifically on one allegation that General Noriega makes in the book, which is that when Bush was head of the CIA in 1976, that he participated in a plan to launch some harmless little incendiary devices in the Panama Canal Zone, thereby to influence public opinion in the United States against holding on to the Panama Canal. A series of allegations, a series of reports about that, and I called George Bush's office and asked to talk to him. They said, "Please send us a fax." I faxed a list of questions, and he responded by essentially denying all of them, as is said in the book. Didn't speak to Colin Powell. I quoted to Colin Powell briefly from his autobiography.
Peter, in your opinion, after these 3 long years in Noriega, why did the United States invade Panama? I know what you say about Bush, and he had the power to do so. And I know that, the headlines at that time were the drugs, the indictment against Noriega. We've had indictments against officers of Cuba for many years, those government officials. We never invaded Cuba. Why do you really believe that we went into Panama?
Well, first, a summary answer and then a longer answer because it's a complicated question. The summary answer is that the United States painted itself into a political corner, that at a certain point in time, it had taken so many policy initiatives, it had tried to get Noriega out by so many other paths, that to save face, there were very few things to do to turn up the heat, because everything that they had tried had failed and Noriega was still in office as he should be. Once it was decided that Noriega would go, and the prestige of the United States was involved in forcing him to go, that's when it became a domestic political problem and not an international political problem. If you recall at the time, George Bush was having problems with his positives and negatives in the polls because every time he tried to get Noriega out, didn't work. How did he try to get Noriega out? Well, the United States spent $10 million or more on the presidential campaign in 1989, which was subsequently canceled by Noriega. Prior to that, of course, economic sanctions had been applied to Panama for more than a year, which left the country at its knees. The statistics are mind-boggling. The gross national product was cut in half. Funds were frozen. People were unemployed, things like that, turning the country from a rather prosperous country in Latin American terms to a country that was in dire need of basic foodstuffs in many cases. What else did the United States do? The United States at least stood by and watched, if not participated in 2 coup attempts against Noriega. What else did the United States do? It attempted to negotiate his departure from power. All of those things failed. General Noriega remained in office, and especially after the October 1989 coup attempt, there was one course to be taken, and that course was not simply to get Noriega out of power, but to invade Panama and to show that the United States would not be toyed with. When it wanted to get something done, it would get it done. That's at least a portion of the answer. It goes a lot further than that. I think in a way you have to read the whole book to come up with an answer for yourself.
Was part of it a threat against Colombia? That if we take and we go into Panama, who is an ally, and Colombia also with the drug background, that they would be next or they would be in line?
Well, I think not only Colombia, but a lot of other Latin American countries whose leaders stood by and watched this were quite nervous as they saw the Panama invasion. Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Colombia, Mexico. They were getting a lesson in ultimately what would be the result of not acceding to U.S. policy. Now, there's a difference, and the difference was that Panama had a very small standing army and was not much of a target. As I point out in the book, the United States debuted its stealth bombers in Panama in a place called Rio Hato, which is an air base which had no Air Force. So the great multi-billion-dollar stealth project bombed and missed its target at an air base with no planes. So really, when you ask the question, was the invasion designed for others to take notice? Absolutely. The same token, if a country tried to invade Colombia, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Cuba, there'd be a lot bigger problem because there would be a lot of resistance. And the biggest problem in any U.S. military activity, as we know, is U.S. loss of life and how that plays at home.
You depict Noriega in the book as someone who's pretty, if you will, naive, and if not naive, certainly very lacking a lot of knowledge about the U.S. and how things got done in the U.S. What culpability does he have in this whole mess?
Well, reminds me of a question that somebody asked me yesterday. This is not your question, but in answering it, I remember that somebody asked me yesterday, does Noriega apologize for what he has done? And I said to the person asking me the question, I don't understand the question in a way. I mean, the first thing we have to do is understand what he has done and what he hasn't done. My thesis is that the 2 points of intervention on my part in this matter, the U.S. invasion of Panama, and something I can talk about a little bit more, the drug charges against him, end up not being areas in which he has much to apologize for. Now, does General Noriega have a reason to answer the Panamanian people? Well, yes, he was the leader of Panama, but any political leader has the responsibility to answer his own country. That does not bring General Noriega to the United States, and that doesn't bring us here today. The point is that in the case of the invasion, he has blame in the sense that he chose not to accept a negotiation in which he would be given some money and sent to Spain in return for the United States getting what it wanted. He has blame in the sense that he was able to survive some coup attempts, and he stood on. He stood on. So, what culpability are we talking about? I make a distinction between whatever the Panamanian political situation was and is, and what the U.S. political situation was and is. I respect Panama as a sovereign country. I am not here to discuss Panamanian laws and what Panama has to say about the events that took place in the 1980s and 1990s, although one has to point out that in the first election after the U.S. invasion, the party of which General Noriega was a member, and which was the military party, won the elections. And the president of Panama is now a member of that party. So in terms of what we can talk about with Noriega in the United States, the invasion, well, yes, he was naive in the sense that he didn't know that the United States would go to the extent of invading Panama. It's evident that up until the minutes before, even after the invasion started, until he actually saw paratroopers jumping out of the sky, he had no idea that the United States was going to invade Panama. Why? Well, as he says, partly because the United States was there already. You know, there were 12,000 troops in Panama all the time. And if there's going to be maneuvers, or if the United States is going to stage an action against some other country, how would he know? How would he distinguish between that and a U.S. invasion? So naive in the sense that he didn't understand what the United States was about to be doing, nor afterward, it's apparent, did he understand the U.S. Legal system. I don't think it's a requirement for him to know those things very well. I'd submit that most foreign leaders might not know those things. As far as the drug charges are concerned, I think that, and I haven't spoken about that yet, I think that it's clear from my investigation, again, assuming that anyone accused of drug charges is going to say they're innocent, and casting that aside, my investigation and my analysis of the key drug charges against General Noriega, which led to his conviction, are that they're heavily flawed. More than 24 convicted felons in the United States testified against General Noriega. I've spoken to one who says that what he testified to was not true. The judge in the case knows very well that at least one or two other of those witnesses, key witnesses, Carlos Lader, a Colombian and the greatest drug trafficker ever caught in the United States, says that he wants to recant under the right conditions. Another witness also says he wants to recant. And now there's an appeal by another witness who was found to have been recruited by the Cali cartel to testify against General Noriega. So those are just some of the highlights. I mean, I could go into more detail, but the fact is that when you start to look at the charges against General Noriega, there are those that say, well, he must be a bad guy, so if he didn't get caught for something, he'd get caught for something else. I don't accept that. I say that it's a country of laws, it's a court system has to be respected. And it seems to me, after all that's gone on, everything that's passed us by with a 9-month drug trial at the cap of an invasion in which the leader of a foreign country was seized as a prisoner of war and brought to the United States, we shouldn't have an unraveling drug case. And one has to remember that the drug case itself was not a unanimous affair. Two charges against Noriega were dismissed. The jury almost hung after a couple of days and finally came back with a verdict. And now that verdict is being appealed, and the Court of Appeals, although it's the percentage are against Noriega, it's not a foregone conclusion that conviction is going to be upheld. So that's all in answer to the question of what is blame. You know, it's a complicated question, and one that has to define terms between who's a Panamanian and who's an American, for starters. what laws were broken in the United States. Yes, sir.
Other than members of the former Guardia, how many or what percentage of Panamanians do you think today regret the departure of Noriega?
I don't know. And I'm not sure that
Do you have an educated guess?
Well, my answer is that I'm not sure it's relevant to my inquiry, because Panama has the right to dispose of its own leaders. The United States, my thesis is, does not have the right.
Question.
I understand
I'm just
that.
asking if you have a feeling about what the Panamanian people feel about the current situation.
I haven't been to Panama recently enough to know. I mean, I'm not trying to evade the question. I don't know. I would suspect that less than half. But I have no idea. Maybe much less than half. I have no idea. It's not central to my inquiry, and I haven't been reporting this or writing this book from Panama. I've been writing it from here, so I don't know. But again, I'm not trying to be evasive. I just simply don't know.
Do you think it's a relevant question, or
Well,
no? Or no?
I think I can put it only in historic terms. I can say that Panama in the late 1980s had problems. Panama was a military dictatorship. Panama had been controlled by the military for most of its existence. It's not so simple to say that a country is a dictatorship. United States is famous for throwing around the word democracy and analyzing, what is a democracy? To what degree is something democratic? To what degree is not? In Panama, after the economic sanctions were applied to Panama to the country by the United States, after the campaign against Noriega in the 1980s, leading up to the elections against Noriega's candidate for president, it was clear to me and clear to most analysts. This is a place where Noriega and I disagree. That had there been a full election, it's very likely, almost self-evident, that Noriega would lose. I can say that. How that translates into percentages now, I can't say. Yes, sir.
I wonder whether you might comment on your co-authorship with John Noriega, the process that was involved, whether you recorded anything electronically, what was done prior to the final version. The focus is given within the book, because as I'm reading it, it's more his point of view than yours, of course. You have asides where you focus in to try to explain, but it's obviously to me his book as opposed to yours. You're just a vehicle.
That's true. I can trace the whole history of the enterprise. Random House approached me and said, "We would like to hire you to interview General Noriega." I said, "I'll do so. I'd like to discuss ground rules." The ground rules that we came up with were as follows: General Noriega would have the right to say what he had to say, and I would have the right to challenge it. But in his portion of the book, what he said was what he said. Similarly, in my introduction and afterward, what I said was what I had to say based on my analysis, and was not to be touched. The substance of the interviews took place mostly in person in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in suburban Dade County, in an administrative building, one-on-one, with a tape recorder, both of us speaking in Spanish. We transcribed the taped sessions. I translated them, rendered them into English, and gave them form and continuity, since obviously we'd be talking about one thing. We might go back to that thing in a subsequent session. And so I gave continuity, edited, put it together, and then gave it back to him. He and people working with him on the book, including his family, edited every word and every phrase to make sure it was exactly what he wanted to say. Footnotes in the book, by and large, are mine. And that's how it went along.
Did he see this at your the sections in which you put in context what he says? I mean, did he see that prior to publication?
He saw it prior to publication, but he had no input in
Did he
changing.
want to challenge something?
Yes. Yeah, I think I can understand some of his challenges, but I think I obviously think he was wrong. He would prefer not to see any human touches that I describe about him. Why? Because he's a military guy. He wants to be seen in that context. I felt that the human touches that I saw gave him an extra dimension that was worth seeing, and they're included. They're probably he's not used to seeing necessarily criticism alongside what he has to say. I differed with him on the elections. I pointed out that even supporters said that the elections were a loss. Now, there's reasons for that, but the 1989 elections were a reality on which we differed. So yeah, there were lots of points like that.
Subsequent to the book's being published, what kind of? I know he's been interviewed by several television stations, right? What is his? Have you spoken to him now since it's come out? Do you know?
Yeah, he would love to be here right now. No question about that. Yeah, I spoke to him. He called me the other day, and he's been doing radio interviews. He did 60 Minutes. He did Telenoticias in Spanish. There was a CNN Burden of Proof program that he did, and he's accepting requests for interviews in general. And he's.
Do you think there's any rethinking of the legitimacy of our going in and arresting him in the trial? Do you get any sense of that from?
Well, I think that there is some rethinking going on I think that there's a confusion and a suspicion about what happened to cause the U.S. invasion in the marketplace, and I think that there's really no rethinking involved among many government officials who were there. I mean, they know what happened, and they know that it was. I think that they really know it was an excess. Now they can say, "Well, look how good we did. Now we've got democracy in Panama." Nevertheless, I think that the issues are rising, and I think the questions remain. And I think I hope that that the questions are significant enough that people will continue to ask questions. And I hope that this is a vehicle for simply asking, why did so many people die? It's my simple question. Was it justified? I think that in Panama, even Noriega's most ardent opponents regret that people died and even questioned the U.S. invasion. Roberto Eisenman, the publisher of La Prensa, one of the greatest critics and opponents of Noriega, called it a national trauma. Other sources I have who had a lot to do with Noriega's demise felt it was an outrage that the invasion took place. So yeah, I think that if they say that journalists are writing the first draft of history, I just think this is the second. Maybe there'll be others. We'll see what happens. Yes.
Would you comment on the process of openness in your relationship with Noriega? At the beginning, he stated that he was very leery of any media representative, and you cited that in your opening comments. And how it progressed. You mentioned that you have been in some occasional contact with him. Is there now a friendship between you and him in terms of having been co-authors? You can define your term of friendship in this case, but how has this relationship matured?
Well, he says he in many times during our interview said yes such and such was my friend, and then he paused and would say there are no such friends in these matters. They're only acquaintances of the moment. And I would say that's a good way to phrase it. I mean, one cannot help when one is talking one on one with another person to find them at times charming and find them at times engaging. And I describe that But our relationship was a working and business relationship in which we had certain goals to accomplish, and we worked together to do those goals, and I think we did it well. I think that the growing ease with which he took the interviews was simply based on the fact that I had pledged to him that I would be fair and give him the chance to say what he had to say, nothing more and nothing less. When he saw that happening, it was very easy to talk.
Did he comment anything about the trial and especially about the fact that one of the attorneys, Neil Sonnet, withdrew from the case, and one of the judges you mentioned in the book said that if Neil had been on the case, he might have won the case.
Yes, he did mention he discussed the trial. At first, he said he didn't want to discuss the trial, but we did start talking about the trial quite a bit, and it's another case in which really he could not have been expected to understand the niceties and the intricacies of the U.S. legal system. He told his description of Neil Sonnet's departure was simply that when he was brought into the courtroom the first time, now you have to remember this is about 3 weeks after the U.S. invasion of Panama, one would have to say that even anyone would be shell-shocked under such circumstances, not speaking English well enough to understand what was going on without an interpreter. Neil Sonnet walked up to him, said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be working on here, or something to that effect, gave him his card and left. Now, Noriega had met Neil Sonnet once before. Noriega did not know that Neil Sonnet was the former president of the Criminal Lawyers Association of the United States. Neil Sonnet had no way to analyze what lawyer would be best for him. The lawyers that he had were lawyers that he ended up with, and that he got along with and gets along with very well, as a matter of fact. But that's not to say that he understood the legal system or understood what legal representation or what a trial was all about. Combined with the fact that the trial itself had some very interesting qualities to it. There was a State Department security officer present at all times analyzing what was top secret and what was not top secret, and anything political was ipso facto top secret. So we had a drug trial with no, as the judge in the case said, political overtones. And the defense lawyers signed security documents so that they could see those documents, but they weren't allowed to reveal what was in the documents under penalty of committing a felony. So in that environment, he was observing what was going on, but somewhat unable to cast a complete judgment on the legal events that were taking place, in my opinion. Yes.
What's your sense of whether Noriega thinks he might get a new trial, and what is your sense of the prospects for that?
Well, he's both optimistic and a realist, from what I can tell. He hopes that the judges of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals will see the argument that was made in his case, and I'll describe that argument. And he hopes that will result in the trial being in the conviction being thrown out. He's also a realist, and he's been told that in the federal U.S. Court of Appeals, probably far less than 10% of all cases are ever thrown back at the district court. However, the substance of his appeal, the main point of his appeal, has to do with a witness named Ricardo Bolanek, who is a Panamanian, a former diplomat, who, unlike many of the other witnesses in the case, was not in jail in U.S. custody when he came in to testify against Noriega, but rather was in Panama, free and clear, and suddenly was brought back to the United States, or brought up to the United States in a plea bargain, which he didn't have to make, and gave extremely damaging testimony against Noriega. Was acknowledged to be the only person to link Noriega to the delivery of drugs in the United States, which is absolutely crucial because the the law under which he is charged with drug conspiracy says that drugs must be delivered to the United States. That's what this guy testified to. All of the journalists at the trial, the ones that were covering it every day, couldn't make heads or tails of this. We were analyzing all the discrepancies between various witnesses' testimony, and you know, there was pressure, there was the promise of a get out of jail free card, there was maintaining one's pilot license, there was getting out of a maximum security jail with no chance of parole for some witnesses. But Bolanek had no reason to be there. I mean, he wasn't. He was free and clear. The substance of the appeal is that, unknown to the defense and unknown to Noriega, Bolanek came to the United States not of his own free will, but because a lawyer for the Cali cartel had gone out in search of a good witness, came up with him, and two U.S. sources, two sources for the United States, testified that they believed Bolanek received $1.25 million in return for his testimony. This didn't come out at the trial, didn't come out until last year. It's the substance of the appeal. In the oral arguments of that appeal, one of the appellate judges said it was clear that, I'm almost quoting, it was clear that the judge of the lower court made a mistake in this case. There's 3 judges, you need 2. Sounds like he's got 1, so he's got some optimism.
What's your informed opinion about whether the appeals would like you?
Percentages are against Noriega. The resident wisdom tells us who Noriega is. Each of you think you know who Manuel Antonio Noriega is. And somewhere in the mind of every judge, they're saying, well, maybe there's some excesses here, but it's got to be because he's a bad guy. And, you know, what's the degree to which we're going to actually look at the evidence and look at the law? I mean, I think it goes beyond the law. And I think it goes beyond what one might say. One has to look at redefining what happened here, and then maybe I'd be more optimistic. But I'm not particularly optimistic that he's going to get out.
Do you think that the public opinion was influenced by the satanization of the character of Noriega by the press during the invasion of Panama?
Well, I absolutely do think so. I think that it was. I think that would be true in any case. I think that the best thing to do when you have an enemy is to demonize that enemy.
But why? And who? I mean, who directed this demonizing of his character?
Well, it wasn't a neat. It's a good question. It wasn't a neat conspiracy, but it did have its roots in a couple of events. One event was the killing of a Panamanian doctor named Hugo Spadafora. This doctor was killed, I think, in 1985, and it was widely assumed and widely reported in the Panamanian press that General Noriega was responsible for that killing. That man, Spadafora's brother, came to the United States subsequently, met with members of the U.S. Senate, and blamed it on Noriega, carried with him press clippings from newspapers in Panama, especially La Prensa, and then reprints and translations of those press clippings in the United States, which said Noriega killed Spadafora, they mutilated his body, and that there was a National Security Agency intercept in which Noriega gave the order to kill this person. And as a matter of fact, I was just saying how judges, including the judge in the case, say, well, maybe the evidence is weak, but he's a bad guy anyway. They cite the Spadafora cases saying, well, he's a bad guy anyway. My investigation of the information that led to one to say that Noriega killed Spadafora to be based on no evidence and lies. I was unable to find anywhere anyone of rank to say that there's a national security intercept in which Noriega was said to say anything to anybody about Spadafora. I spoke to the chief of station of the CIA. I spoke to the chief of station of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I spoke to the U.S. ambassador in Panama. I spoke to Elliot Abrams, who was the deputy assistant secretary of state for Latin America. They all said no such thing, never happened. They would know about it. I then spoke to the person who first wrote the article that said that there was a National Security Agency intercept. That person could not provide me with a source for his story and told me instead that his story had certain inaccuracies in it. And yet, 95% of the American people will, if they know anything about it at all, will say, well, everybody knows that Noriega killed Spadafora. The U.S. ambassador to Panama at the time, Everett Briggs, no friend of Noriega's, is now the head of the America Society in New York. And I asked him, what do you make of all of this? And he said, I have no reason to think that Noriega killed Spadafora. I never have seen any evidence of such. It easily could have been one of Noriega's lesser officers who at the time was plotting a coup against him. So that was the start of the vilification campaign. It built up steam. There was an indictment against him. There were disparaging remarks about him. He became a central casting figure rather than a reality. It's not to say that as an American, I'm simply saying that what is the evidence that leads one to take us to where we are today? Not saying that in Panamanian terms, Panamanians don't have a right to argue about who their leader is going to be. Up to them. But in the case of Spadafora, it's the one case in the book in which I simply looked at the evidence in Panama, found it lacking. The answer that most people have is, well, he must have known. It's the same thing about the drug charges. He must have known. But, far down the line, we have no evidence of that. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to look for some evidence. And I did that. Yes.
How much double checking did you do in the book in terms of following up on what he said? Basically, there was a lot that you weren't familiar with that needed double checking or could have been double checked.
I did a considerable amount. However, and I was present for lots of the events that took place. However, Noriega's part of the book has every right to be what he had to say, and I'm adding it to, and he is adding it to the historical record. He hopes, and I'm really interested to see debate and argument both in Panama and the United States about the things that he says. Some of the things are not true and false types of things, and most of the material that I look at is not true and false types of things. He may get a name wrong, he may get a date wrong, he doesn't have files, but he talks about his early life, he talks about his relationship with Tarico, says he knew it. Now others may say it's a different relationship. This is the relationship as he know it. He knows it. He talks about his experience of the October 1989 coup. He talks about his experience the night of the invasion. These are not true and false types of events. He describes things in ways that provide more perspective and can add to the historical record. So yeah, I do a lot of checking, and I provide notes. It could have been heavily annotated. It could have been a scholarly work in which every phrase is related to some other phrase. I chose not to do that. It's not intended to be a scholarly work. Although, and some of the things should be open to broad debate to discuss exactly what happened in Panama during that period, which to this date has never been done.
One final question. Do you think General Noriega now still aspires in some way, if it were possible, to go back and be a political or military leader in Panama?
I can tell you what he has said to me, which is that he hopes for the day when he will walk out the front door of that jail with an apology from the United States and will be able to go back to Panama. He looks for the day when he can go back to Panama and be a Panamanian in his own country. I really don't think that I've asked him that question. He's never answered it, and I think it's far ahead in the chess game, and I don't know where that stands. I think that from my perspective, the likelihood that that's going to happen is, is beyond where I needed to go.
My sense is that it still burns within him, that he still wants that. That would be my opinion, without really knowing him, but just from what I read in the newspapers. But and assuming his character.
I can't say that that's the case. I can't say that that's the case. I mean, I think that he knows the political reality in Panama, and he's talked about going back to Panama one day, and I don't know how soon that's going to be, and I don't think he does either. And I would kind of doubt that one could have any, in his situation, could have any realistic political aspirations.
Peter, thank you.
Thank you.